Hi, I'm here today with Adam Dranowski, who delivered this year's W.O. Atwater Memorial Lecture. The Atwater Lecture was established to recognize scientists who have made unique contributions to improving the diet and nutrition of people around the world. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm interested in learning more about your research and your lecture. So can you start by telling us a little bit about your background and what you study? You've done a number of things going from biochemistry to psychology and now public health. How did you get interested in these topics?
Well, a good question. So I'm originally from Poland, so that makes me both a refugee and a migrant. And I went to school in Britain and began by studying chemistry and biochemistry. So my thesis was on X-ray crystallography. And then I went on to study psychology at the Rockefeller University in New York. And I realized that nutrition was really a combination of biochemistry and psychology. On one hand, you have to know the basic metabolism and the basic biochemical processes, but you also need to know psychology. You need to know the psychology of behavior and choices that people make when they buy food. So then I went on to the University of Michigan, and I started working in a school of public health. And that was many decades ago. And I have stayed in public health ever since, specifically public health nutrition. And I'm now professor of epidemiology at the University of Washington.
Fascinating. Public health and especially nutrition really do bring a lot of different things together. And it sounds like you have the perfect background in a lot of ways. And there are a lot of issues to explore. The one that you looked into in your lecture in particular was the affordability of a healthy diet. Why did you choose that topic? Why do you think that's important?
Well, I've always been interested in nutrition economics. What drives food choices? You ask people why they buy food, and they'll say taste, cost, convenience, health, and variety. And my research has always been about the first two. I started looking at taste. We'll talk about that more later on. Taste of sugar and fat, especially, and a combination of sugar and fat, which are very pleasant and very rewarding to people. And then I realized that sugar and fat were not only good tasting, they were also extremely cheap. So suddenly you have those ingredients in our diet, which are palatable, rewarding, exciting, and extremely affordable and produced by the food industry. So it was a transition from taste to cost and to nutrition economics. I think probably in the future, I'll deal with variety and health.
Yeah, so many different aspects of this issue. Do you think when people think about things like health, nutrition, and affordability, there are misconceptions out there because so many people are saying so many things? Are there certain points that you would like people to understand in thinking about these issues?
Yes. What I want people to understand is that food choices are not necessarily individual choices. They're very often driven by circumstances beyond your control. So when we look at people and we say, you shouldn't be making this choice, you should be making that choice, those are very complex economic decisions. I really truly believe that people make the best decisions for them. And who are we to tell them what to do? And let me just tell you about the low cost of empty calories, because it's a big issue. Given current prices, you can actually get a pound of sugar for 89 cents. And that means you get 2,000 calories for $1. 1 day's intake for $1, and you're not hungry. You're not well nourished, but you're not hungry. That's a big issue for many people. Sometimes they say, the only food label we ever look at is the one that says, 79 cents. That's all we care about. And you really cannot take that away from people because, as I say, those are not choices. Those choices are driven by economic circumstances, which are really, as I say, beyond their control very often.
So that is an important point, and maybe not one that people think about first when we have the whole debate about what people should be eating. So that's helpful. You also talk in your lecture about a few other concepts that are pretty critical to understanding these issues. The first one you talk about is something called energy density. Can you tell us a bit about what that means and why it's important?
That actually goes back to Wilbur Atwater. So Wilbur Atwater made the point, it was actually in 1894, that when we price food, we do it per pound, per bushel, per some measure of weight or volume. No, I would say that a kilogram is not a good measure of nutrition. We should not be looking at prices per kilogram of food or per pound of food, because energy density, calories per gram, is driven by the water content of food. Water contributes to food weight. Water provides no calories and water provides no nutrients. And just think about it, a kilogram of cabbage can be very cheap, but a kilogram of cabbage, 2 pounds of cabbage, is about 400 calories. But you take a look at, say, 2 pounds of wheat flour, and you have more than 4,000 calories. And Atwater and colleagues made that observation as early as 1902. So this idea that energy density was important and we should be pricing foods per calorie really goes back to Atwater and back to the dawn of the 19th century and the beginning of nutrition research in the United States. I think this is very profound. We ought to be pricing food and estimating the cost of food per calorie or per nutrient and not by weight. That's a big issue.
Yeah, so there's been a pretty long running effort to really help quantify our diets in a way that's useful. And this energy density concept really kicked that off. But it might, as you suggest, not be the only thing we want to think about. So you also talk about nutrient density, which is maybe a more recent concept and different in important ways from energy density. So can you tell us about the difference and why nutrient density might be something we want to pay attention to as opposed to just energy density?
A very good point. So nutrient density is the mirror image of energy density. When you look at energy density, it is calories per gram. So water obviously is 0 calories per gram, sugar is 4 calories per gram, fat is 9 calories per gram. Very simple. Foods which are energy dense are essentially foods that are dry. Think chocolate or cereals or grains, and those are very different from hydrated foods of low energy density, like, say, spinach, broccoli, more water than anything else. Now, nutrient density is very different. Nutrient density is nutrients, usually nutrients per calorie. So foods which are nutrient dense or nutrient rich, I call them nutrient rich, are the ones with more nutrients than calories. And foods which are nutrient poor are those with more calories than nutrients. The US Department of Agriculture had another name for those foods. They used to be called empty calories of minimal nutritional value. That's exactly what they are. I prefer to use the term, empty calories of minimal nutritional value. Those are foods which are nutrient poor. And you pretty much know what they are. Those are foods which give you calories, but don't give you enough nutrients. The problem is that many of those foods are cheap, and this is the root of the major problems that we have with our food supply. The foods which are cheapest are the ones which are rewarding and pleasant and palatable and low cost, and they provide calories, but they do not provide sufficient nutrients. Another way of saying that is to say that calories are cheap, nutrients are expensive.
So all calories truly are not created equal. It sounds like there are some that do a lot more for us. And let's dig into that a little bit. So we have heard that nutrients are important, but which nutrients specifically do you have in mind when you talk about nutrient density, and what kinds of foods have those?
That's an excellent question. So here I distinguish between what I call positive nutrition and negative nutrition. Positive nutrition focuses on nutrients that are actually present in foods. And here I would identify protein, especially high quality protein, more about that later on. I would say fiber, and I would say priority micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. You know what they are: iron, zinc, calcium, vitamin A, vitamin C, folate, B12, and so on. So this is positive nutrition. You're looking at calories packed with nutrients. Each calorie has to have its load of nutrients. But then there's another view which looks at energy density as the key factor. And here, nutrient density is characterized by the absence of calories, the absence of sugar, the absence of sodium, and the absence of fat. And you can say nutrient-rich foods are those which contain minimal amounts of fat, sugar, and salt. I say yes, but unless you take care of the positive nutrients, you'll end up with a glass of water.
Oh, so nutrient density is both about what we include, but maybe also about what we exclude.
Exactly. So in fact, quantitative measures of nutrient density are very often balanced. I'm referring to what's called nutrient profiling systems, and nutrient profiling systems take the positive nutrients and balance them or weigh them against the negative or problematic nutrients. So the overall nutrient density is some combination of both. You take the positive into account or you take the negative into account. And where you come out on that scale very much depends on your health priorities. There's another point I want to make, and that is that nutrient profiling depends on the major identified public health issues. So if your major identified public health issue is obesity, overweight, non-communicable diseases, you want to remove calories, fat, sugar, and salt from the food supply. If your major issue is nutrient deficiencies or inadequacies, you want to promote foods containing protein, fiber, vitamins, and minerals, and desirable food ingredients such as whole grains. So it all depends. Nutrient profiling does all those things.
Okay, so we have systems to start to think in a very precise way about what we want and should include in our food. Now, that all, of course, depends on being able to afford the food, which is the point of your talk. So you've talked about that relationship between nutrient density on one hand, and then on the other, the cost, the affordability. So can you tell us a little bit more about that relationship and what kind of implications there are to the fact that nutrients have a cost?
Well, that goes back to the statement I made before that nutrients are expensive and calories are not. So when people are trying to reduce food spending, for again, reasons beyond their control, their food budget is less, prices have gone up, combination of both, they'll be driven towards foods which provide more calories per dollar. You don't want to be hungry. You can go without vitamin C or calcium for a day or two. You cannot go without calories for a day or two. So that paradoxically, saving money on food drives food choices towards more energy-dense foods with more calories, fat, sugar, and salt, fewer nutrients. And those foods have been associated with overeating. Remember, many of those foods pack a whole big load of calories into a very small volume. It's so easy to overeat. 100 grams, 3 ounces of food can be 500 calories if it's fat, sugar, and salt. So as a result, trying to reduce money on food gets you in the direction of lower costs but worse diets and may promote overeating, overweight, obesity, and so on can follow from that.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about those issues, because that's been a major topic of concern in public health, is the fact that we have this so-called obesity epidemic, that people are overeating, maybe even that certain foods encourage overeating. And as a result, we're seeing increases in things like diabetes, heart disease. How do these concepts that you've talked about here with nutrient density, nutrient profiling, and so on relate to these disease and health outcomes that we're so concerned about in public health?
Obesity is a very interesting and complex issue. Now, many people say that obesity is the result of indulgence, lack of willpower, some kind of a behavioral problem that can be fixed. I say absolutely not. To me, obesity is a visible symptom of economic deprivation. I say that people make choices for reasons that are economic reasons. They are not necessarily the best choices, but because they're not necessarily the most nutritious choices, but they're the only ones they can make. So obesity and poverty are actually linked. And we have done studies showing that there are huge disparities in obesity rates by area, by neighborhood, by census tract, by census block. And both diet quality and obesity rates and the rates of diabetes depended on neighborhood and varied a great deal by going from one neighborhood to another. So that was a socioeconomic factor driving both diet quality and health.
Interesting. Would you say that's a key determinant? Are there other factors that are highly correlated with these health outcomes?
I would say that economics of some sort is the key determinant, because I think that incomes and education are very closely linked. And then where you live is very closely linked to what you can afford. So as a result, socioeconomic factors work three ways: at the level of individual income, employment, education, and also the neighborhood that you live in. And of course, the neighborhood that you live in has a given purchasing power, and supermarkets decide to locate there or not, depending on the purchasing power of the neighborhood. So think about that. Did you ever see Whole Foods or Walmart side by side? No, they're in different areas of town. And those areas have different purchasing power. So again, I'm saying that the food supply and the food environment very often determines people's food choices.
Okay. Now, there's another issue that has come up a lot in this discussion, which is the concept of ultra processed foods. Can you tell us a little bit about that concept and how it relates to some of what you're talking about here?
Oh, just touched my favorite topic. So this is actually very interesting. The term ultra-processed foods was coined by Professor Carlos Montero, a friend and a colleague at the University of São Paulo 12 years ago. I think it was the result of a confusion between formulation engineering and processing engineering. So initially, Carlos Montero said that ultra-processed foods had nothing to do with the food's content of fat, sugar, and salt. It all had to do with bright packaging, quasi-addictive ingredients, ingredients or components not found in normal kitchens, and so on. So actually, the definition of ultra-processed foods seems to be differing from one study to another. That's another point. But later research really showed that most of the foods falling into the ultra-processed category were actually high in calories, high in sugar, high in saturated fat, and high in salt. True, not all of them, some. Carlos, for some reason, exempted foods made at home. But okay. And those foods, no one talks about that, are cheap. So all the links between ultra-processed foods and adverse health outcomes, ill health, obesity, diabetes, all those various things are, to my mind, completely confounded by food cost.
So is the ultra processed debate a bit of a red herring? Would it make more sense for us to look at some of these other qualities of food that you've mentioned?
I think the ultra-processed food debate is a complete red herring, and I think there are other ways of assessing nutrient value of foods. Some of them involve the nutrient profiling systems that I've outlined to you. And I'm thinking that we need to talk more about the low cost of ultra-processed foods, because that is the driving factor. For example, the proportion of ultra-processed foods in a diet of Seattle residents very much depended on the value of their home. I can tell you, richer people eat natural, fresh, organic. Poor people do not. So this brings me back to the issue of affordable nutrient density for all. We shouldn't be saying that everyone ought to be eating fresh, organic produce from local fields. Not everyone can afford that. What about families or households with limited budgets? So we need to do something there as well.
So that brings me to the last question, which is that you have outlined a lot of different concepts and maybe some new tools for how we could productively think about diet and how it relates to health, particularly with respect to purchasing power, and some of these things that go beyond just the individual. So what should people take away from what you've presented today in terms of what the implications are for public health and how we can help people generally achieve better dietary outcomes?
Well, there are two approaches. I want to say a good word for nutrition education, because interestingly enough, education is more predictive of higher diet quality than our incomes. So there's really no substitute for education. And then I say that people who really have good diets are those with education, money, and time. If you have education, money, and time, no problem. If you have education and time, you can cook for yourself, you can do interesting things on budget at low cost. But many people are 0 for 3. No education, no money, no time. What about them? They are pretty much at the mercy of whatever it is that the food industry puts in front of them. And I think that there's a huge, major role for the global food industry, because low-cost foods do not have to be composed of grains, fat, sugar, and salt. There is room for new technologies. There is room for fortification. There are very interesting new technologies that minimize added fats and sugars and sodium. There are new technologies for enrichment and fortification that depend on synthetic biology, precision fermentation, new fortificants, new ways of making sure that foods are nutrient-rich and yet remain affordable. But for most part, those foods are processed. So I want to say a good word for processing, fortification, and enrichment, because I don't think that we will be able to achieve affordable nutrient density for all without processed foods.
Okay, now when you talk about fortification and enrichment, can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by those terms?
So fortification means adding nutrients to foods. In the United States, most of the fortification is voluntary. For example, milk is fortified with vitamin A, vitamin D. It already has natural calcium. That is voluntary fortification. But then in other countries, you have mandatory fortification of oil or even sugar or salt with fortificants such as iron or zinc or vitamin A. Okay? Enrichment, the term enrichment classically refers to putting back nutrients which were taken away during processing. So for example, flour is enriched. Cereals are fortified. So there's a kind of little technical distinction between the two. But I think that fortified foods, and there are new ways of fortifying foods with products of bacterial fermentation, that's a very interesting way of increasing nutrient density without necessarily increasing cost.
So there have been some great takeaways today in how we might think about food. One is to look at the nutrient content as well as just the number of calories. Another is to think twice about this concept of processing and whether it's necessarily a bad thing. But it sounds like the real point about affordability that you're trying to make here has to do with the fact that income and socioeconomic status and education are kind of core drivers of our diet. And there are implications from that for public health and what we and the food industry might do.
I would absolutely say yes to that. I would say that economic factors are absolutely critical. And what we need to do is to remove the underlying social disparities which prevent people from accessing healthy, nutritious foods. And so, building a new supermarket in a given area will not help. You need to take off the underlying social disparities. And there are various ways of doing that through a number of socially oriented programs.
Adam, thank you so much for talking with us today. I think we've learned a lot about food, how we can think about it, and how we might be able to make healthier food available to more people. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you, Catherine.